Renee Kalman Brigham, one of the co-instructors of Power Systems Journey, and I'm here today talking with Carl Knetsch. Hi, Carl. Would you introduce yourself, your name, affiliation, how you're connected to the class, and any other thing you want to share?
Yeah, hi, Jonay. So my name is Carl Knetsch. I'm a former student of the Power Systems Journey course, as well as a previous guest instructor for the course for one semester. Um, Once upon a time, I studied biology as an undergrad here at the U. I also studied environmental policy as a graduate student. So I'm someone who's very interested in the politics of climate change or US politics in general and the energy transition in general. Um, Also someone who's a lover of art and things like movies and music and books. And I like to think about ways in which fictional stories can impact the ways in which we think about the world, can help contribute to our kind of collective culture as a society and the way we think about ourselves.
Great. What have you been up to lately?
Yeah, so lately I've been working as a home energy auditor for about the last year and a half. So that means I get to go into people's homes and evaluate how their homes are working in terms of energy efficiency, which means evaluating the insulation levels and the air sealing quality of the home, assessing HVAC systems like furnaces and water heaters, and then making appropriate upgrades where we are able to. So we also do a lot of work identifying and alleviating health and safety issues like asbestos, lead, radon, mold, poor air quality, and more. Um, but yeah, the main thrust of the work is about weatherizing homes and making them more energy efficient.
So, what do you think are the lessons we can learn from energy history to inform the future? And in this time of shifting energy policies and priorities, what do you think are the longer term trends?
Yeah. So I think one general thing we can learn from history and from energy history is that everything is contingent. And by that, I mean everything is ultimately determined by the actions of human beings and our societies and our governments and our collective actions. So I think nothing is predestined to be the way it is now. It's just simply happened by kind of countless actions, um, by countless numbers of human beings and their societies. Um, so what I'm really getting at is that because everything we've built up to this date and time is in a sense arbitrary, that means that we, the people, also have the power to build as new whatever we can envision, um, which would hopefully be something new and better than what we have at this moment in time. That's not to say that the existing electric grid is bad, as it obviously has served a very important purpose throughout our history. Um, but rather, I'm just saying that we have the power to build something qualitatively different than we have now, something more based on renewable energy, something that can ensure that all of our people will continue to have access to electricity that is one of the most defining staples of modern living. So basically, to summarize, because humans have the power to determine their own destinies, that means that we can collectively build what is necessary for the future if we have a vision and we put our minds towards realizing it.
What kind of energy stories do you think would engage the public to learn and care about the energy transition issues? And what values and goals do you think should inform the energy transition?
Yeah. So I think that people, for the most part, care about things that are directly tangible to their own lives. Um, for the most part, the average American does not care, so to speak, about the power grid or even, say, renewable energy, but just because they have more immediate concerns, like their jobs or paying their rent or putting food on the table and so on. That's not to say everyday people don't care about the environment or climate change or things like that, but rather just that many people in America simply have other things to worry about, more important things to worry about on a daily basis in terms of their own lives and their families' lives. Um, so I think the challenge for people involved or interested in climate change or energy transition work um, is to find a way to relate this work to the lives and the needs and concerns of everyday people. Um, for example, transitioning to solar or wind or nuclear energy or modernizing electric grid infrastructure or other electrification work can all be framed in terms of things that people can relate to, like creating more jobs or making living environments more free from fossil fuel pollution or reducing plastic waste or reducing automobile traffic and increasing walkability or bikeability in cities or increasing local food production instead of shipping highly processed food halfway across the globe before it's eaten, and so on. So I just feel like using concepts such as these when describing potential energy policy changes can be more tangible to people than talking in relatively abstract terms such as global carbon emissions or carbon footprints, etc. Um, that stuff's still super important, and I'm glad that there are, you know, highly qualified scientists researching that type of stuff that are thinking about the big picture and all that. Um, but I just think in order to relate it to everyday people, we should try to emphasize that we can decrease carbon emissions while simultaneously doing things that make quality of life better for people, which is something that people really care about at the end of the day, is making life better for themselves and their families and their communities and so on. Often in the media and by certain politicians, the energy transition tends to be framed as something that uh, necessarily will decrease people's standard of living or that it'll take away the things they love or whatever. Or, um, but we need to make the case that that's not true. And I think we need to make the case that actually the complete opposite is true, that the way to make people's lives better going forward actually is by caring more about the environment and making things more sustainable. Um, so overall, basically, I'm just saying that I think we should always try to keep in mind the human dimension of the transition rather than only thinking on, abstract terms like carbon emission goals. Um, yeah.
So, how might the energy transition reimagine our electric generation, distribution, use, ownership, and everything else about our energy systems to achieve our goals?
Yeah, so I think that the question of ownership is a very important thing when we think about the energy transition or moving away from fossil fuels. Um, for instance, who owns the electric grid or who manages it or who regulates it and maintains it, who owns the generation and distribution facilities, and what are the goals and ends of all these actors. Um, One thing I think about a lot is with fossil fuel companies, which operate for profit, will they be ultimately be able to stop producing fossil fuels if it's against their direct financial interests to do so? For instance, they have investments in drilling sites and production facilities that are in place for decades going forward, which they want a return on investment on. So presumably they're not voluntarily going to give that up. And if it's not in their interest to do so, then what do we have to do as a society or from a policy perspective to make it in their interest to do so? Um, we've seen climate policy in recent years that aims to stimulate renewable energy production. But in my opinion, we haven't really seen anything that will force or heavily encourage fossil fuel companies to wind down their production or to totally stop their production. Um, they have their own pledges and goals and stuff, but it's not anything that's truly binding, is my understanding of it. Um, so I don't know if these companies will voluntarily, you know, truly make their best effort to meet their own goals. Um, so I think if we start from the conclusion that fossil fuel companies need to cease or at least wind down their production, then I think we need to work backwards from our conclusion to envision what needs to happen in order to make that a reality. Um, so I think to go back to the question of ownership, it's possible that the ownership models of fossil fuel companies could need to change in order to truly be able to wind down production. Um, Perhaps bringing the investor-owned utilities into public ownership or community ownership would allow for a planned winding down that simply couldn't happen when their investments on the line and the long-term needs for profits. Um, for instance, there are already many existing publicly owned or community owned utilities in our country that provide energy to millions of people around the country. Um, and my understanding is that they have lower rates and they're able to have a higher control over their energy production sources since they're not-for-profit companies and they can focus more on kind of democratic decision making when they decide how they want to produce energy and what their values are when they are choosing what energy sources to use.
What do you want people to know about the energy transition?
Yeah, so one thing I want people to know about the energy transition or just a general way of thinking about the energy transition is I think it's important that we conceive of the energy transition as something that we all have to consciously work towards and to strive for, rather than simply thinking about it as something passive that's already in the process of happening and that we don't have to think about it because it's just set in motion and it's going to take care of itself. Um, that's not to be pessimistic about it, but it's just thinking of the fact that we do all have to think about it and think what policy changes will be needed, what changes to our society, the way we organize things would be necessary in order to ensure that the transition is successful. Um, so I am thinking a little bit about the new presidential administration. There's the potential for policy rollbacks or budget cuts or things like that to different environmental or energy agencies. So just with that in mind, I feel like going forward, we all need to be conscious of the fact that the energy transition does have a political dimension and it does need to be kept in mind. We need to strive to keep the values of the or our desired values of the energy transition in mind in order to make sure that we can successfully implement it.
What ideas or experiences from the class have you carried with you, both as a student and as a guest instructor?
So one thing that I always appreciated about the Power Systems Journey class was its emphasis on interdisciplinary thinking and creative thinking. And it's about understanding how the electric grid isn't just a dull, lifeless machine, but rather it's a very vibrant thing that is connected to many different aspects of our lives and of our society. And it physically connects everything together via communication or infrastructure or social structures or whatever you can think of. Um, so hopefully I've demonstrated from my previous answers that the power grid is not just a technical thing or an engineering problem to be solved, but rather that it's an incredibly complex system that has a political dimension, an economic dimension, social dimension, geographical dimensions, and so much more. Obviously, there is a large technical and engineering dimension to the grid and to the energy transition, which our next generation of engineering students will work on and will attend to going forward. But what I really wanted to get across is just that all these other dimensions as well are also very important beyond just math and science and engineering.
So, what else is on your mind, Carl?
Yeah, it's hard to not have political stuff on your mind in these days, I would say. I guess anyone who's been following the news probably thinking about some of the same things that I'm thinking about, just with the current administration, and some attacks on federal government and basic agencies that kind of help our society function. So I think we're seeing that even agencies or programs or policies that seem very neutral or apolitical are going to be subject to politically charged attacks or threatening with defunding or disbanding or so on. Um, so I think we can apply that thinking to the grid as well. I haven't seen anything specifically about the grid yet, but there's a chance there's some sort of political attack on the grid in terms of like defunding the regulation or the agencies that are in charge of maintaining it or regulating it. Um, I can't say for sure what would happen, but changes to the way it is currently, embedded in our politics and policy could be on the horizon. So it's just something to keep in mind and to think about, or to keep an eye out for. Um, I'm just brainstorming really, but I just think it's something to keep an eye on in this day and age, um, where even these kind of fundamental, seemingly apolitical parts of our society might be subject to being questioned or being changed. Um, but I think that also fits in with a lot of what I was saying earlier, just about how the grid has a political dimension, an economic dimension, and so on. So it's just worthwhile to um, think in these terms instead of only thinking of the grid as this kind of thing that just exists and no one no one has agency in terms of changing how it works because it is within our, social systems and our government systems and so on. So we can keep that in mind when we think about how we want to um, change the grid and how it needs to be changed for the energy transition going forward.
Yeah, well, that goes through the questions, and we have a little time for some open discussion. I'm thinking of what you just said and related to what you said earlier about the importance of ownership, and curious, what you think about leanings in the current administration towards favoring privatization of various, infrastructures. Do you see what are you thinking there?
Yeah, I haven't followed the news too closely or seen anything too closely with regards to specifically like the energy grid or changing the way utility companies are regulated or whether they're privately owned or publicly owned or anything like that. Um, but in general, I think we should think about just what it means when something is privately owned versus publicly owned. I think in the case of like investor-owned utilities, when they have a certain profit motive on the line, that will always impact how they operate and what their ultimate goals are. Um, if they if the bottom line of making a profit is the most important thing, then it would be difficult to do that while also attempting to accomplish other very important goals like decarbonizing or implementing more renewable energy. Um, I suppose it could be done, but I think when something's under public control, you would just have a much easier time to consciously plan for something and to set a goal and to attempt to tackle it versus when it's privately owned, we're just kind of saying, well, you're this private entity, and we're kind of hoping that you will follow along with our larger governmental or societal goals. Um, but if utilities were to be under public control, for instance, it would just be much easier, I think, to try to consciously strive towards, the goals that we need to meet.
One other thing that comes to mind from the discussion is um, the work you're doing now, the home energy audits and working with individual homeowners. Um, do you feel like that's just as relevant, if not more so, in these times, or how do you feel about that at this point in time?
Yeah, I think it's definitely relevant work, but I think it is just one very small piece of, a larger energy transition framework. It does decrease energy usage, but I think we know like changing the actual production sources of the grid is probably the most important thing in terms of decarbonizing overall. So even if we make you know, a large number of homes more energy efficient, if they're still ultimately powered by a power grid that's sourced by fossil fuels, then they'd still be contributing to carbon emissions. So I think keeping our eye on like the big picture of how we generate energy overall is really important. Um, yeah, and in terms of, I guess I don't know if you were referring to like job security or like that field in terms of like current
Oh, just
political
the
happenings
role of
or
that kind of work, however you want to
yeah.
answer that.
Okay. Yeah, I
Yeah.
think I pretty much covered what I
Yeah.
wanted to say then.
Unless there's anything else you want to bring up, I guess my kind of final question is: are you hopeful? Are you? How are you feeling about uh, the energy transition? The values you have about the grid and the transition?
Yeah, I think I kind of follow this philosophy of like pessimism of intellect, optimism of will, that type
Mm,
of thing. Sometimes it can be very draining to follow the news and see all these constant barrage of seemingly negative headlines and stuff. Um, but no matter what happens, we still have to persist and continue fighting for what's right. And I also think, just because things are bad now potentially doesn't mean that they can't get better. And I think there is this kind of natural cycle that happens in our world where, well, things get bad for a little bit, but then it awakens a sort of political consciousness in people. And then all of a sudden they get more active and then changes are able to be accomplished. So I think we're seeing lots of, you know, political awakenings and activist movements and stuff for a lot of various issues, not specifically energy transition necessarily, but
mm,
at this moment in time, we're seeing a lot of activity among people who otherwise might not have been super active in the past or whatever. But yeah, so just thinking about how things come in cycles and um, if the needle goes too far in one direction, there's typically the ability to kind of self-correct in the other way. So I guess
okay,
that's how I view it.
great. Well, thank you so much, Carl. Really appreciate your time, and it's great to see you again. And glad for the work you're doing in the world.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me.